What seemed like a routine flight turned into a political earthquake at the heart of the monarchy within minutes. Without warning, Prince Harry returned to Great Britain. Not for a ceremony, not for reconciliation, but triggered by a revelation that set long-standing divisions in motion. The catalyst for this development wasn't a press release, but an internal approval, ironically from within Prince William's inner circle. It quickly became clear that this return followed no protocol, but rather an escalation. The mystery began at the airport. No cameras, no escort, no official reception. Prince Harry stepped off the plane alone, accompanied by a conspicuous silence that seemed louder than any flashbulb frenzy. The pickup didn't follow the usual channels. A vehicle normally reserved for Catherine left the premises without any signage, without being listed in the official calendar. The crucial point wasn't how, but who. The approval came from Prince William's office and bypassed all formal procedures. A break with established patterns of questioning provoked outrage. Why did the heir to the throne open the gates to a brother he had kept at arm's length for years? Observers interpreted this move not as a gesture of rapprochement, but as a reaction to something that could no longer be ignored. Within palace circles, word spread that the situation was critical. Clarence House was only informed after the fact, and the press office remained silent. This sequence of events was unusual and signaled urgency. Simultaneously, references circulated to a dossier that had recently reached Prince Harry. The documents, it was said, had been reviewed, dated, and legally sound. These were not rumors, but rather verifiable connections that touched upon the very core of a marriage. Meghan Markle suddenly found herself at the center of a web of financial dealings, agreements, and secrecy that coincided with the beginning of their relationship. The explosive nature of the matter lay less in the existence of a past than in the allegation that it had been actively managed and concealed. While Prince Harry's return remained largely invisible to the public, behind closed doors, events intensified. Legal teams worked at full speed. Requests for delay and protection were prepared. However, every attempt to buy time increased the pressure. The assessment from within the monarchy was that the situation was not controllable, but rather reactive. Prince William's move was therefore interpreted as damage control, not an offer of reconciliation. The dimension of this development extended beyond familial tensions. It was about loyalty, about knowledge, and about who knew what and when. The fact that the return proceeded not via Buckingham Palace, but through a discreet route, reinforced the impression of an emergency. The monarchy, it seemed, was preparing not for an embrace, but for a confrontation. In the background, it became clear that King Charles was involved in this sequence of events. Internal briefings indicated that previous assessments existed, which had been deemed unremarkable and irrelevant. Now they were being re-evaluated. The line between caution and secrecy moved to the center of the debate. Prince Harry's move to London thus became more than just a trip. It triggered an institutional self-examination. At the same time, public perception began to shift. The absence of official statements created a vacuum that was filled by speculation. The media questioned whether this was the beginning of a legal battle or an internal clarification with far-reaching consequences. Prince William's granting of permission without appearing publicly himself was interpreted as a calculated distancing. At the end of this first act, there was no resolution, but rather an escalation. Prince Harry's return was not a signal of calm, but the beginning of a phase in which the monarchy was forced to react to revelations that called its own logic into question. The shocking core lay not in the trip itself, but in the realization that mechanisms cultivated for decades had suddenly failed. What information was so significant that it bridged years of divisions? Why did the heir to the throne choose speed over distance? And what role did Meghan Markle play in a web that now revealed how thin the line between private and institutional life had become? The answers to these questions were yet to come, and they promised to be more far-reaching than any reconciliation. What initially seemed like a personal shock quickly developed into a matter of systemic dynamite. At its heart was a dossier whose very existence, within a matter of hours, carried more weight than any public statement. The documents that had reached Prince Harry were not a loose collection, but rather systematically examined and time-stamped. They painted a picture not based on speculation, but on documented processes that stretched back to the very beginning of his relationship with Meghan Markle. The core message of these documents lay in a series of financial transactions that had gone unnoticed for years. Individual transfers, each legally secured and formally correct, together revealed a pattern. The timing of the documents, coinciding with crucial phases of the relationship, left little room for coincidence. Observers described the content as matter-of-fact, almost technical, and precisely for that reason, so destructive. The issue wasn't moral judgment, but rather the realization that information existed that had never reached Prince Harry. Particularly explosive was the reference to non-disclosure agreements, which not only concerned external third parties but also apparently served to completely shield certain chapters of the past. The documents contained evidence of arrangements that went beyond mere discretion and suggested an active manipulation of public perception. The gravity of the situation stemmed from the conclusion that these mechanisms had continued even after the marriage. Within the palace structure, this revelation triggered alarm. Legal advisors assessed not only the content but also the provenance of the documents. They were considered legally sound and so well protected that simply dismissing them seemed impossible. Any attempt to delay their release increased the risk of creating the impression of confirmation. The monarchy was forced to react not only to a potential revelation, but to the fact that a key member of the family felt deceived. Meghan Markle's role was thus redefined. She no longer appeared solely as the subject of media controversy, but as an actor in a complex web of protection, control, and secrecy. For Prince Harry, this meant a double shock. Firstly, the realization of the existence of this past, and secondly, the awareness that it had been systematically concealed from him. The emotional dimension amplified the political one. Simultaneously, frantic steps were taken in California. Legal measures aimed at containing the content and preventing publication. However, from the observer's perspective, these activities appeared more like a reaction than a control. Within hours, various media outlets were circulating the assessment that every behind-the-scenes move indirectly underscored the veracity of the allegations. For Prince William and King Charles, the focus shifted. It was no longer just about moderating family tensions, but about protecting the institution from a narrative that called its decision-making logic into question. Had the silence been out of consideration or calculated? This question became the core of the debate. The monarchy, traditionally valued discretion, faced the accusation of having destroyed trust through its silence. The dossier complex acted as a catalyst. It forced positions to be taken without a safe space to do so. The dynamics accelerated because the documents were not isolated but emerged during a period when public trust was already fragile. The idea that central truths had remained hidden within a marriage struck a nerve far beyond royal circles. At the end of this phase came a bitter realization. The real crisis lay not in the contents of the dossier alone, but in the question of how long and by whom they had been controlled. What began as a private problem threatened to escalate into a structural challenge. Was the silence a shield or a tool of deception? And how much truth can an institution that has thrived on control for centuries tolerate? These questions remained unanswered, yet they laid the groundwork for the next rupture. For the dossier was not the end of the escalation, but its beginning. It paved the way for confrontations that were now unavoidable and whose consequences would extend far beyond personal relationships. With the dossier as the trigger, the crisis definitively shifted from the private to the institutional sphere. Prince Harry no longer sought explanations in the public sphere, but answers within the family. The focus shifted to King Charles, to the level where information converges and decisions about silence or action are made. What followed was described by observers as a turning point because it shook fundamental assumptions about protection and loyalty. At Clarence House, the situation intensified into a confrontation characterized less by emotion than by disappointment. The central question was not whether information existed, but whether it had been deliberately withheld. Internal records indicated that checks had been carried out before the marriage, routinely discreet and without formal consequences. Such assessments are considered a precautionary measure within the monarchy, not a vote of no confidence. However, in light of the dossier, these procedures took on a new significance. King Charles confirmed internally that reports had been submitted, which had been deemed not to have any bearing on the matter. They had no criminal relevance, but had revealed discrepancies. The decision not to disclose this information was made from an institutional perspective. Discretion was considered a protective mechanism, not only for the crown but also for the individual. This very point became the crux of the rift, because for Prince Harry, this logic represented a break. The notion that silence should be interpreted as care clashed with his demand for transparency. From his perspective, withholding information was not protection, but rather a disempowerment. The realization that the institution had prioritized differently than the family fundamentally altered the dynamics. The conflict was no longer perceived as a personal misunderstanding, but as a structural problem. Within the palace walls, the prevailing view was that this confrontation had been inevitable. The monarchy thrives on the balance between openness and control. But in this case, control had prevailed. Observers spoke of a generational issue. While Prince Harry insisted on individual truth, King Charles defended a system that prioritized stability over disclosure. The two positions were irreconcilable. Simultaneously, external pressure mounted. The media and the public began to question the role of silence. Was it legitimate to withhold potentially damaging information to maintain order? Or was this very practice the origin of the current chaos? The discussion shifted away from Meghan Markle and toward the workings of the monarchy itself. Trust in internal checks and balances began to waver. For Prince Harry, this period marked a renewed estrangement. Not only was his marriage cast in a new light, but so was his relationship with the institution he had once defended. The sacrifices he claimed to have made now appeared in a different context. The question of whether loyalty had been one-sided became the central motif of this escalation. From the monarchy's perspective, a dangerous precedent loomed. Admitting that silence had been a mistake would call into question decades of established practice. Adhering to it would risk confirming accusations of coldness. This dilemma determined the actions of the coming days. Every step had to be carefully considered. Every sentence could open new fronts. At the end of this period, there was no reconciliation, but rather a clarification of positions. The roles had been redefined. Prince Harry as the seeker of truth, King Charles as the guardian of order. The conflict had thus reached a level where personal feelings receded behind institutional interests. Therein lay the tragedy of this development. The crucial question remained: can a monarchy built on silence deal with a generation demanding transparency, or is this divide insurmountable? This tension paved the way for the next, even more violent rift, the one between brothers, which was not only familial but also symbolic. The conflict reached its emotional and symbolic climax when tensions between Prince Harry and Prince William erupted. What had long been considered a simmering rift now became openly visible, taking the form of a confrontation that could no longer be moderated. Within a few hours, evidence mounted that the issue was not about old grievances, but about concrete accusations that shattered the foundations of familial trust. Sources close to Kensington Palace revealed that Prince William was pressing for a direct resolution. He dispensed with intermediaries, phased talks, and the usual diplomatic procedures. This decision alone marked an escalation, signaling that the conflict was no longer being treated as an internal difference. For the heir to the throne, it was clear that boundaries had been crossed that could not be relativized. At the heart of the matter were indications of attempted unauthorized access to sensitive areas of the royal infrastructure. Internal records revealed digital traces leading to external actors whose connections to Meghan Markle had been documented in the past. Even though Prince Harry's direct involvement was not proven, the suspicion alone was enough to further erode trust. For Prince William, it wasn't just the legal question that mattered, but also the political dimension. The integrity of the institution was compromised. Another aspect, considered taboo within the family, proved particularly damaging: private information. Details concerning Catherine had been leaked to external platforms in fragmented form. Internally, this information could only have originated from a very limited circle. The perception that safe spaces had been violated further intensified the situation. Prince William saw this not only as an attack on his family, but on the very foundations of their unity. His reaction was accordingly harsh. The heir to the throne stated that he had lost patience with separating personal ties from institutional responsibility. At this stage, the narrative shifted definitively. Prince Harry was no longer seen as a brother in crisis, but as a risk whose proximity could cause harm. This reassessment had immediate consequences for all subsequent decisions. For Prince Harry, this development meant further isolation. His attempts to distance himself from the events were met with skepticism. The initial trust had been exhausted. In the public perception, the image began to solidify that the rift between the brothers had become irreversible. The media spoke of a point of no return, because the conflict could no longer be reduced to misunderstandings. Within the monarchy, there was growing concern that this fraternal conflict could become symbolically charged. The heir to the throne, representing stability, and the renegade prince, perceived as unpredictable, formed a contrast that could easily become a narrative of division. It seemed all the more important, therefore, to draw clear lines and define responsibilities. By the end of this period, it was clear that the relationship between Prince Harry and Prince William had not only been damaged but also redefined. The familial sanctuary had transformed into a security policy issue. The consequence was a strategic realignment that focused less on reconciliation and more on control. What role does fraternity play when institutional stability is at stake? Can trust be restored when suspicion runs deeper than words? And was this rift the result of personal choices or the logical consequence of a system that prioritizes loyalty over closeness? These questions shaped the next phase, a phase in which other actors came to the fore and deliberately shifted public perception. While the open break between the brothers dominated the headlines, the real power struggle moved in a different direction. Amidst the escalation, Thérèse emerged as a stabilizing force, without uttering a single word. Her presence, however detached, became a strategic counterweight to leaks, accusations, and internal turmoil. This very silence proved more effective than any statement. The morning after the internal conflicts, Thérèse appeared at a public event, deliberately chosen to be low-key. No announcements, no political messages, no reference to the events. Yet this very normalcy was interpreted as a signal. In a period dominated by uncertainty, she embodied continuity. Observers described it as a calculated gesture aimed at regaining trust without further escalating the conflict. Simultaneously, a new communication strategy was established behind the scenes. Instead of reacting to accusations, Kensington Palace focused on presence and reliability. Appointments were not cancelled but deliberately kept. The message was clear. The institution continued to function regardless of internal conflicts. This strategy contrasted sharply with the frenetic activity across the Atlantic, where Meghan Markle was increasingly withdrawing from public life. A palpable sense of reticence spread through the entertainment industry. Projects previously considered safe were reviewed. Collaborations postponed. Officially, the explanation was cited as substantive differences. Unofficially, as a growing risk. The name Meghan Markle, once synonymous with attention and reach, was now associated with uncertainty. This shift demonstrated how quickly narratives can change when credibility is called into question. Within the monarchy, this development reinforced the impression that control could be regained not through confrontation, but through consistency. Catherine was perceived in internal circles as a stabilizing force, not as an active participant in the conflict, but as a symbol of continuity. Her public appearances provided a counterpoint to the dynamic of revelations and countermeasures. At the same time, the pressure on Meghan Markle increased. Legal steps aimed at shielding her met with an environment that was increasingly distancing itself. Media outlets reported on planned publications that now stalled. Sponsors hesitated, platforms waited. The era of unconditional support seemed to be over. Instead, caution prevailed. This shift also affected the public perception of Prince Harry. His position appeared increasingly isolated, squeezed between institutional demarcation and a partner whose influence was waning. The image of the rebel fighting for transparency lost clarity and gave way to a portrayal in which the loss of control took center stage. At the end of this section, it became clear that power in this crisis was defined not by volume, but by steadfastness. As narratives dissolved and new ones emerged, the side that favored stability gained ground. The question was no longer who was right, but who could maintain public trust. Was silence, at that moment, stronger than any explanation? Did deliberate restraint have the potential to weather a storm that open confrontation would only have intensified? And did withdrawal from public life signify an admission of defeat or merely a phase of reorganization? These questions paved the way for the final act, in which the institutional consequences became visible. As events unfolded, the focus shifted definitively from personal conflicts to institutional repercussions. Within a very short time, measures became apparent that demonstrated the monarchy was no longer reacting, but acting. Prince Harry's return had triggered a chain reaction that culminated not in reconciliation, but in restructuring. Decisions previously considered unthinkable were now being soberly examined. At the heart of the matter was the question of formal affiliation. Internal votes led to a reassessment of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's roles within the system. The issue wasn't symbolism, but operational clarity. Responsibilities were frozen, public engagements reduced, and institutional interfaces severed. The move appeared technical, yet it had an enormous symbolic impact. The monarchy redefined its boundaries. Simultaneously, a legal review began, extending far beyond the current crisis. Documents concerning succession to titles and existing regulations were examined. This revealed the profound interrelationship between tradition and law. In an order built on continuity, any ambiguity carries significant weight. Accordingly, the approach was cautious yet consistent. The aim was to close any loopholes before they could be exploited publicly. The political dimension of these steps quickly became apparent. Attention grew in various parts of the Commonwealth. The media questioned whether the monarchy was still capable of guaranteeing stability when internal rifts were so openly exposed. This skepticism increased the pressure to act. Any delay would have reinforced the impression that control had been lost. In this context, Prince William gained prominence, not as a brother in a family drama, but as a guarantor of order. His demeanor was described as cool but resolute. He refrained from emotional signals and instead relied on clear structures. This approach resonated with those observers who saw the crisis less as a human drama than as a test for the institution. For Prince Harry, this phase meant further marginalization. His public presence diminished. His room for maneuver shrank. His portrayal shifted from actor to object of institutional decisions. His attempt to demand the truth had placed him in a position where he had little influence over the consequences. This dynamic reinforced the impression of a definitive break. Meghan Markle, meanwhile, faced a different reality. Her withdrawal from key projects, the reluctance of partners, and the uncertainty surrounding future platforms painted a picture of an abrupt end to a period that had thrived on attention. Public perception tipped from curiosity to distance. Instead of debates about narratives, questions of responsibility dominated. By the end of this period, a pattern had emerged. The monarchy did not respond with empathy, but with structure. This decision was risky but consistent. It made clear that individual stories were subordinate to the logic of the system. For critics, this confirmed the accusation of coldness. For supporters, it was proof of its ability to act. The crucial question now was whether this reorganization could regain trust. Is institutional clarity sufficient to mask the cracks created by silence and escalation? Or does this moment mark the beginning of a long-term alienation between the monarchy and the public? The answers to these questions will become clear not in days, but in years. The events surrounding Prince Harry's surprise return to Britain do not mark an isolated incident, but the culmination of a development that has been building for years. Triggered by a damaging dossier and exacerbated by institutional silence, a family conflict transformed into a structural crisis of the monarchy. The focus was not only on the relationship between Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, but also on the question of how much truth an institution that has relied on control and discretion for centuries can tolerate. The monarchy's reaction followed a clear pattern. Instead of emotional mediation, strategic demarcation dominated. King Charles embodied the logic of the institution, while Prince William visibly assumed the role of guarantor of stability. The consequence was a reorganization that subordinated personal ties to systemic necessities. This stance created clarity but simultaneously deepened the rifts within the family. At the same time, public perception shifted. While Catherine stabilized trust through presence and continuity, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle increasingly found themselves on the defensive. Their withdrawal from public life and projects was interpreted less as a strategy and more as a reaction to a loss of control. The narrative of a self-determined exit gave way to the image of an escalation with unpredictable consequences. In the end, we have a monarchy that has consciously chosen order over empathy. This path may signal stability in the short term, but it raises long-term questions. Can institutional harshness replace trust damaged by silence, or does it reinforce the impression of distance between the crown and society? It also remains to be seen what role Prince Harry can play in the future, now that his position within the system has been redefined. This crisis is therefore more than a celebrity drama. It is a stress test for an institution caught between tradition and modern expectations. Whether the chosen strategy strengthens the monarchy or deepens its alienation remains to be seen. One thing is certain: the consequences of this escalation will extend far beyond the current headlines.